Good afternoon. Calling to order this Policy Committee meeting at 3:33 p.m. On the agenda today, we'll be discussing Policy EEA, the Student Transportation Services Policy. So we can go ahead and roll on.
Good afternoon. I'm John Land, Executive Director of Operations.
Good afternoon. Jacinta Hughes, Transportation Director.
Afternoon. Robert Marshall, Assistant Director of Transportation.
So we're here to introduce to you and to the public our Student Transportation Services Policy and Regulations. We'll go over some of the sources of our information, what we ended up with as far as policies and regulations that have been drafted, our stakeholder engagement, our timeline, then we'll give an overview of the policies and regulations. A couple of years ago, we had a consultant that evaluated transportation, and one of their recommendations was for us to develop policies and regulations. They identified about 8 subject areas that they thought effective school systems had policies and regulations in. And what you see on this PowerPoint are 8 of those areas. General information, definitions, complaint management, stakeholder responsibilities, planning, technology, operations, and then emergency preparedness and response, our safety piece. And we used that as a guide to what we wanted in our policies and regulations. And we went to 4 LEAs, public school systems, that had policies in place and some regulations, and used those as a guide to round out these areas and what we should include. We went to Anne Arundel County Public Schools because they're a total contractor system. We are mostly contractor. Baltimore County Public Schools is a mix of contractor and their own publicly owned fleet, which we have some publicly owned vehicles. Then Montgomery County Public Schools it's an entire public fleet, but it's an exemplar in the state. The transportation system there, it's referred to quite a bit by other LEAs and MSDE as a good place is to get ideas and best practices from. So we selected theirs to look at. And then New York City Public Schools was referred to us by someone at MSDE who has worked closely with us and continues to do with transportation issues. She works in the special ed education department and focused on transportation. So
one of the things that I can already predict that our colleagues on the larger board are going to ask, these don't appear to be like districts. They're not TUTA districts or other districts that have, Baltimore County, Anne Arundel, and Montgomery are all vast land masses. We're not such a big land mass. They don't have the concentrated poverty that we have. New York system has a huge, really fairly successful public transit system that some may say we might not be quite so successful. So I know that they're going to ask to see, what's Cleveland doing? What's Detroit doing? What's DC doing? Okay. Although DC has a different kind of public transport as well. But yeah, they're going to want to see this compared to some districts that look more like us.
Okay. Then we took those 8 areas and those sources of information, and we had in our existing, we have standard operating procedures in transportation, and those have been recently updated, and they have been vetted with MSDE and with our Office of Special Education, and we use those as a source for a lot of our regulations to put the way we do business into our policies and regulations. And our legal department reviewed those and reviewed these policies and incorporated a lot of those regulations, those standard operating procedures into our regulations. So that's what we have here are in those subject areas the drafted policies and then our regulations that you see listed there. They cover safety, our operations, stakeholder responsibilities, definitions, student eligibility. And so we'll go into our policy, our stakeholder engagement. We've already talked with CCAC, and we'll continue to talk with CCAC because they're a very important stakeholder in this, but we have reached out to Pizzazza and PCAB. Now that we've released these, we'll be able to firm up some dates and to get them this information to review. And we'll also talk with the Charter School Group, Student Congress, and the Maryland State Department of Education. Well, with that individual there and the Director of Student Transportation at MSDE does work closely with us and will be a valuable source of input.
Perfect. And obviously, the principals at Claremont and Bear and Briscoe are going to be the ones that are going to have the most stake in this.
Yes,
So hopefully that'll be called out as data,
yes.
but maybe get weighted a little heavier.
And then our policy timeline, as we're introducing it today, we hope to get it approved in January. So there'll be a lot of stakeholder engagement between now and then. And then once it's approved, we'll be developing our implementation plan, our communication and professional development plans, and we want to implement it July 1st of 2019.
So just one suggestion on this slide, when you present to the whole board for first reader, having the approval June 30th makes it look like we're out of the timeline for compliance to policy adoption, because it has to be within certain, so just, it maybe just change that approval to implementation. It's a little thing, but it will make us look like we're out of policy compliance for the process. Does that make sense?
Yes. So this speaks to the students who are eligible that we are going to provide transportation to. So there are students that are what we call distance eligible. Elementary students that live more than 1 mile walking distance from their neighborhood school, and then middle and high school students who live more than 1.5 miles of walking distance from their school are eligible for corner-to-corner transportation, the yellow bus for our elementary students, or the MTA fare for the middle and high school students. Then we have a lot of our mandated transportation, which is our door-to-door service. It's students with IEPs, homeless students, ESOL students, students who are medically fragile, students who attend a pre-K program but have an IEP in that program, and then students who attend a suspension program who have an IEP. Then we talk about we have in our policies that's the response that our responsibility is to safely transport students in school vehicles. That our responsibility, transportation's responsibility ends when the student exits the vehicle and at the bus stop at the end of the school day. So our responsibility for their transportation begins when they step on the bus and when they step off the bus at the end of the day. And then with the students who are walking, our responsibility starts when they enter the school, on the school property, and exit the school property. And again, this is the eligibility. Students are eligible, again, who live within that walking distance, which for elementary it's 1 mile. Greater than 1 mile, and then greater than 1.5 miles for middle and high school students. And then our students that have needs of accommodations with IEPs, 504 plans, medically fragile, ESOL, homeless, and foster care students.
For the distance eligible, can you specify within the presentation for the board what that is? Is it 1 mile? You said it's 1 mile, and what is the actual distance?
It's for elementary students, it's 1 mile walking distance from their residence to their enrolled school, the neighborhood school. And then for high school and middle school students, it's 1.5 miles walking distance to their enrolled school.
Okay, thank you.
So related to that, are there any policy level prescriptions for dangerous roads? So I live 1/2 mile away, but on the other side of 83. Do we have provision for those circumstances in policy?
No, not in this policy, but we make those provisions. We don't have a prescription for what's safe and unsafe. We have staff that evaluate it on an as-needed basis, and we provide transportation for students that we believe who do not have a safe walk. But most of those
It might be
students
something to help just in clarifying that from an equity purpose for which parents, so it's not just the squeaky wheel that gets oiled, but the actual need gets met. To have a regulation that says, if it's 4 lanes or no controlled intersections within that 1/2 mile radius, something along those lines to consider.
Okay. Here we identify our main modes of transportation in the policy: the MTA, the yellow bus, taxi cab, and a school vehicle. Most of what we use are taxi cab, yellow bus, and the MTA. We talk about routing in the policy, that we'll do every effort to balance ride times with our resources. We'll evaluate and approve requests for routing. OPT does the final approval. The Office of Pupil Transportation, that is. We'll evaluate the student's eligibility for bus and taxi cab service within their school boundary. The age and health and physical condition of the students will be considered. The location of the student's home, the number of students in areas being serviced, and the availability of our buses and road and student walking conditions will be considered. Safety is a driving concern for us, and it's a driving focus. It's a very big piece of what we do on a daily basis, Jacinta and Robin and their team. So the policy addresses 3 areas. It addresses accident response, it addresses driver and bus attendant and taxi cab driver certification, and it addresses the drug and alcohol program, testing program. We do random alcohol test of bus drivers and taxi cab drivers. We do, they have to have a drug and alcohol when they come into the program. They have a random alcohol and drug throughout while they're driving for us. And we also do drug and alcohol test for drivers after any accident.
So clarifying question for the sake of the public and other bodies that may be interested. How does this apply if it's a contracted so we contract with bus company A. Are we still responsible for doing the periodic drug testing and criminal background checks, or is that in the MOU that's company A's responsibility?
So, once they become a part of a certified driver for city schools, then we administer the random testing. So we would notify the contractor that driver A has to report, and we monitor to make sure that the random testing is done.
So we don't have drivers that are not city schools employees? We don't have,
Yes, the contractor drivers, but they are a part of our random selection
so
pool.
they, okay,
Yes.
okay, perfect, thank you.
Responsibilities is an important part of this policy. We address the Office of Pupil Transportation responsibilities, the responsibilities of our bus and taxi cab contractors, the responsibilities of our drivers and bus attendants, responsibilities of school administrators and staff, students and parents and guardians. And our driving responsibility at the Office of Pupil Transportation is to ensure that we're compliant, and drivers are compliant, and contractors are, and our drivers are with state and federal laws, rules and regulations, and the board policies. For instance, an example is that drivers are commercial drivers drivers with a commercial driver's license can drive, or they have to be randomly drug and alcohol tested. That excludes taxi cab drivers, but we decided to include taxi cab drivers into that random and drug and alcohol test as well. So that's an example of an administrative regulation that's not necessarily a federal requirement that we do to ensure safety. And there, it's also the responsibilities, again, for our contractors, our bus contractors and taxi cab contractors, that they uphold the policies and regulations, that they comply with, accident reporting, that they comply with drivers being ready for training, that we get the background checks, the criminal background checks, the Department of Transportation physicals, that we have all that paperwork in place, and that it's authenticated and validated that driver is indeed can be certified to drive students. So that's an important piece. And then the drivers themselves, that they need to uphold laws and regulations, that they can't make decisions on their own while they're transporting students. There's just a variety of circumstances that a driver is faced with, and we are trying to get some control around what their decision should be and what their response should be. Third party that's really important to us are the school staff, and that the importance there are when the student's on board, are they onboarding safely? Is that driver being polite and kind, showing good customer service? Same with the bus attendant. Is there someone there at the school to greet the students as they on board? And is there someone to help the students when they board and leave school, that they're getting on the right bus? And another important piece for the school staff what's that data coming to transportation look like? Is that address accurate? Is the pickup locations? Sometimes the students have to go to another school. Is that school identified clearly in there in the information? There's all these requirements that are on the student's IEP in that data, and are they accurate? And that really helps us get the first pickup right the first time. Of course, parents and guardians are important. We really think it's important that parents, they're a partner in this, that they're there to pick their students up, or they have someone designated to pick their students up at the end of the day. And then, of course, the students. It's important for them to abide by the student code of conduct. We do have regulations in here as far as students in their conduct on the bus, that it doesn't get so out of hand that it's unsafe for the other students and for the bus drivers. Things like opening windows, hanging out of a bus window, things like that. So that's an overview.
If for our elementary school students who may be in specialized programs, if it is still not their neighborhood school, the school within their neighborhood, they're not offered transportation to attend those programs?
What students?
Mount Royal, do they have like an ingenuity program or something like that? So students are coming to that school perhaps from all over the city. They may not live in Bolton Hill and Reservoir Hill. So do they have access to the transportation, or their parents have to then provide that transportation for them if they want them to attend that school, if they're in that program?
Yes, the parents would have to provide that transportation unless that student has an IEP or they're homeless and they attend that program.
Okay, thanks.
So one of the questions that always comes up on this that I think bears worth for public comment is, can we look at Uber, Lyft, Freedom Cars, some of the other options for alternative transportation besides taxis, to help drive market costs down as well as increase efficiency for kids?
We've been advised not to, because there's some controls as far as certifying the drivers. Uber I believe they operate with, like on an as-need basis. And then you just don't know who the driver is who's showing up. With the contractors we have an agreement. The drivers have to go through our training. They have to be drug tested. They have to participate in our random alcohol and drug test. There's accident requirements that they have to, if there's an accident, they have to report their accidents. Some have to come to training. Some will be suspended. I think the advice to us is that Uber and Lyft are harder to control for that. However, I do think, and what we presented this morning at the Operations Committee, there could be opportunity for us to leverage that with our existing companies, taxi cab companies, for better rates, and that's what we're going to explore.
So I know that there are some LEAs out there that are working on doing a self-screener to screen a pool of Uber drivers that are qualified and their cars have met the safety requirements. But there are other car services, like Freedom Car here in Baltimore, which is a woman-owned business that we could have more control over, but also be supporting local business and be able to maybe do that competitive edge to get some better rates for our students.
Okay, we can explore that. Do you have
How
some?
would we screen them?
I would guess we'd run them through the same screening process that we do for the taxi drivers, because the taxi
So
companies are
the
excellent.
problem with the outside companies in accordance to COMAR that we are governed by for the state of Maryland, we haven't been able to get approval from the state to allow us to seek like a company like you're speaking about, as in addition to with the transportation work group that we did all last year. We sat and the people, our stakeholders, gave suggestions. We had the state transportation director at the meeting who also stated, like, we can't use vans to transport students. So in accordance to COMA, a lot of our options have been tied down to not having that safety element and not being able to vet and validate the drivers. I mean, even with our contractual pool that we have now, it's a constant chase to make sure that our contractors are using staff that has been certified through our school, through the Office of People Transportation.
Nowhere in this policy do we see anything about bicycles and about collaborating with the mayor's plan to increase bicycle ridership in the city or other nonprofit organizations. Is there thought been given to that? Was it excluded for a reason?
So we transport the 4,000 some students that we transport predominantly are special needs or IEP, so we didn't consider like the bicycle because most of them are mandated by federal or state, but we can certainly go back and look. I hadn't looked as far as using bicycles.
Dr. Washington?
So I think that for the most of the students that are transported, they're transported because they don't live within a walk zone or it's more of a requirement.
Mm-hmm.
But no, I think that we should definitely looking at other initiatives that are happening around the city and how do we
Because that would help possibly capture some of our under 1 mile kids and their safety and protection and being very clear that on their bikes they're still not protected or not our responsibility to tell they're on school grounds. Some of those conversations, as soon as we put a bike rack up, then now are we responsible from home to bike rack? Or are we just responsible at bike rack? And some of those would be better served having policy underneath them.
Okay.
Along with that, obviously there's two sort of areas of education that I see in tandem, not necessarily specific to this policy, but that I'd like to use this policy as a way to highlight, and that's bike safety education and driver's ed. I know Milwaukee Public Schools implemented a free across-the-board high school graduation requirement of a driver's ed course. And when we think about the road conditions and the realities of driving in Baltimore, that driver's ed course might go a long way to improving overall community wellness. Maybe it's just my neighborhood where red lights are optional. So both of those components of education, at least a mention to curriculum development or ideas around using this as a leverage point for educating students. GPSs, we made a operations procurement last year to put GPSs on buses. Do you have anything to share? There was nothing here about GPSing in the policy or the regs, but will all buses have it? Is it making a difference and impact for the client services end?
Yes, all buses do have GPS units on them, and there may be a few brand new buses that we haven't got to yet, but the majority of our buses do have GPS units on there, and it is helping us improve our customer service when trying to locate where buses are and talk to parents to give them an accurate arrival time, especially when we're getting it from a contractor who may or may not give us that accurate time. But what we're doing now is working to look at on-time arrivals from a holistic scale, because right now we can pull any bus to see where it's been since the GPS has been installed, but we're trying to develop like a system process where we can tell you which buses were late yesterday. So,
And we anticipate adding a regulation for GPS once we work out the processes that Robin is talking about.
And then another regulation that I think might be a benefit from a little bit more beefing up regarding like add-ons to buses is the cameras, and is specifically around FERPA and who can and cannot release video footage to whom and under what circumstances. It's in one of the regs, but if I'm a bus driver, I need to know very clearly I can't give that to Fox 45, or I'm not giving that
Okay.
to Mrs. Johnson because she asked nicely. That is really very much protected information. It's not subject to Public Information Acts, those kinds of things
Okay.
to be
We-
spelled out really
We
clearly.
can make it more explicit.
Would be helpful. I think that may be the only other piece that I have in my notes would be the acronym ESOL. I'm not sure if that's contemporary best language. You might want to talk to Laura Ohanian and see if it's not supposed to be just L's, EL,
Okay.
English learners rather than, and I'm not sure what the legal is, but I know it's gone to L's in academics, so.
Okay.
And I think, then the other piece that I didn't see, and I very easily could have missed it, is what about midday transportation needs for suspensions, dismissals, illness? In my understanding, at this point, we have to call a police officer to drive a child home. Do we have regulations on when we can call a cab for somebody in the middle of the day, or cab usage for parents, for conferences? What city schools covers budgetarily, what we don't? Those were other pieces that I didn't see, and I don't know if they should be in the scope of the policy or not, but
Okay.
went looking and didn't find.
Okay. We'll take a look at that.
Commissioner Berkeley? Commissioner?
Why is in the use of support vehicles, it's the regulation, it's RL. It gives, in the event of an accident, it says, this is K2, any driver involved in an accident or incident resulting in personal injury or property damage is required if physically able to submit an incident report within 48 hours of the incident or accident. Why not sooner? What's the thought process around 2 days?
Those regulations are for, and we can shorten that turnaround once we talk with staff, if it's possible. Those are really for drivers, like our maintenance staff who drives vehicles, our engineering staff, our ground staff. But we can look into shortening that. That makes
It's not
that's a good
necessarily shortening. I just wanted to know why it was 48 hours typically.
So typically, that's like the time frame that it takes, like from a driver that is employed in the ground shop to bring the paperwork over to transportation. But if it is a bus driver or cab driver, we expect to have the accident report or incident report within 24 hours.
Sure. 48 is just the cap.
Usually it's usually 48 hours. So rather than be audited on something that we can't obtain,
Sure.
I selected the 48. But we can. I mean, that's general what happens.
You don't have to change it. I was just wondering why it was 48. I'm just curious. Thank you.
So my last point and question would be, we spend an enormous amount of money on transportation for really good reasons. And we have legal obligations to students to provide them the transportation. As a board, though, we're constantly told things like, well, we can't really do a magnet system because we don't have great transportation. We have challenges with equity and distribution of selective high schools and access to those because we don't have transportation. I would love to be able to look at the public and say that we're really, really looking at how do we do it differently and how are we being innovative and how are we trying to increase opportunity and access for every student in each school across the city that's not limited by transportation, whether that's lobbying MTA for different routes, whether that's increasing after school and Saturday access to MTA so kids can get to Saturday and after school programming. I'd love just to hear what operations in the transportation department, what your vision is for how this becomes an awesome value add to the school district in 5 years versus nope, this is the legal compliance and this is where we're stuck.
I think one of the, for me, speaking for myself, my perspective, the conflict in this business that we are now is the demand versus the supply. And it's sort of what the constraint that's always present. And it's when someone asks for transportation who's, maybe has an issue that they need it because the parent is now been in a car accident. We get that. The parent now can't transport their student to school. Those are tough decisions because there's no legal requirement. But you're short. You can't get transportation for every student. You have 1,500 kids on cab who, aren't on bus. And so for me, that's the constraint. Now, in a 5-year, what do we aspire to in 5 years? We are working with drafting a plan on what it would take to make transportation more accessible if we had more supply of it. And, more contract monitoring, more buses, more drivers, more bus attendants. And we are looking at that, and we do want to spell it out over 5 years.
Speaking for myself, I really look forward to hearing that and seeing it and seeing how we can, this seems like one of those pieces that is incredibly hard to tackle, but also at the same time sort of a low-hanging fruit that we could do something substantial citywide to really improve lifestyle and outcomes for everybody by improving transportation.
Yes.
So could we get a breakdown of transportation costs when this is presented to the board?
I believe we have it in our transportation update from last quarter. Yes, the transportation costs, how we allocate what's cabs, what's
Yes.
mandated
we've
by
presented it.
Bento, what's special ed. Do we have that?
Yes.
Okay, yeah, I thought so. But yeah, that might be a great appendix to stick in when you present this to the board. So. Okay. Other questions? All right, well, that was relatively painless, hopefully relatively painless for you all. Our next, whoops, where am I? Sorry about this. Our next policy meeting is on November 20th in this room, where we'll be talking about school year, the number of days and holidays, and attendance policies. And I'd like to just throw out positive thoughts and wishes. We don't have any public comment today, but our PCAB treasurer, who is not here, Shantae, we're just sending you love and positive thoughts for your family. And with that, we are officially adjourned at 4:08 p.m.